What actually happens when someone arrives at the German border and asks for protection? Behind this question is a fairly complex but clearly regulated process. Let's take a closer look at it together, step by step, from the very first contact to the final decision. Everything begins with one important principle, and it's important to understand that this is not just an empty phrase, it is the foundation of the entire system. In Germany, asylum is not a political favor or a temporary decision. It is a legally enforceable constitutional right. This fact strongly shapes the entire approach to asylum. At its core, the asylum system is about protecting human dignity, life, and freedom. The right to asylum is the legal response of a democratic state to war, persecution, and terror around the world. This principle is the standard by which every step of the procedure, no matter how bureaucratic it may seem, must be measured. Before we go deeper, let's quickly clarify a few terms, because official language is very precise. At the beginning, before the application is officially submitted, a person is called an asylum seeker. Once the application is formally filed, the person becomes an asylum applicant. And if the application is successful, the person becomes a beneficiary of protection. Each of these terms comes with specific rights and responsibilities. So let's start at the very beginning. Imagine someone arrives in Germany. What happens in the first hours and days? The first step is a formal one. The person reports to an authority. Usually this is the federal police at the border or a police station inside the country. The second step is registration. Personal data are recorded, a photo is taken, and fingerprints are collected. This is important to confirm identity and to ensure that no one submits multiple applications. Only after this process is the person assigned to a federal state. After registration, the person receives the first important document, the arrival certificate. You can think of it as a ticket into the system. This document proves that the person is officially registered in Germany. It also allows access to basic necessities such as accommodation, food, and medical care. Without this document, the person is practically invisible to the system. But how is it decided which federal state someone will go to, Bavaria, Hamburg, or Saxony-Anhalt? This decision is not made by a person but by a computer system called EASY. You can imagine it as a digital sorting system. Based on a fixed quota, it calculates which federal state should receive the next applicant. The goal is to distribute responsibility fairly among all states. Now the first phase is complete. The person has been registered, assigned to a federal state, and accommodated. The next stage begins, the core of the asylum procedure. Now the case is officially submitted and carefully examined. The next important appointment is the formal asylum application. For this, the person must go to a branch office of the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees, BAMF. A translator is always present to avoid misunderstandings. At the end of this appointment, the person receives another document, the temporary residence permit during the asylum procedure. This allows the person to remain in Germany while the case is being processed. You might think that now the reasons for fleeing are discussed. But first there is another important step. BAMF must answer a fundamental question. Is Germany actually responsible for examining this asylum application? This is where the term Dublin Regulation appears. The idea behind it is simple. Each asylum application should be examined only once within the European Union. Usually, the responsible country is the one where the person first entered the EU. For example, if fingerprints show that someone was already registered in Italy, Germany can transfer responsibility back to Italy. But if Germany is responsible, then the most important moment of the entire procedure follows, the personal interview. This is when bureaucracy moves into the background. Now the focus is on the individual and their personal story. During the interview, the applicant sits in a room with a BAMF case officer and a translator. The task is to explain everything, why they fled, what happened, and how the journey took place. Every statement is translated and carefully documented. This written record becomes the most important basis for the final decision. Once the interview is completed and the documents are reviewed, the applicant must wait. Eventually, a letter from BAMF arrives with the decision. But it is important to know that a yes does not always mean the same thing. There are different types of protection. Let's look at them from the strongest form downward. The highest level is constitutional asylum, granted to people who are politically persecuted by their own state. The next level is refugee protection under the Geneva Convention, which also covers persecution by groups such as militias or terrorist organizations. The third level is subsidiary protection, granted when serious harm is likely, for example during a civil war. The fourth level is a national ban on deportation, for example when essential medical treatment would not be available in the home country. For every application, the authority must examine all four protection categories. They review them step by step: asylum, refugee protection, subsidiary protection, deportation ban. Only if all four are rejected can the application be fully denied. Even in case of rejection, there are different types. A regular rejection means the legal criteria were not met. In this case, the person has 30 days to leave Germany voluntarily. There is also a rejection as manifestly unfounded. This is more serious and happens when the authorities consider the story clearly not credible. In that case, the deadline to leave is reduced to just 1 week. Once the decision is made, the final question arises: what happens next? The answer depends entirely on the outcome. If the decision is positive, the person receives a residence permit. They can work, attend integration and language courses, and begin building a new life in Germany. If the decision is negative, the situation is very different. The person is legally required to leave the country. If they do not leave voluntarily, deportation may follow. However, in a rule of law system like Germany, an administrative decision is not necessarily the final word. Every rejection can be challenged in court. The case is then reviewed by an independent administrative judge. If the court decides that BAMF made a mistake, the decision can be overturned. If the appeal fails, the obligation to leave remains. And that brings us to the end of this overview. The German asylum procedure is a highly structured and bureaucratic system, but behind every file number and every form there is an individual human story, often a dramatic one. And this leads to a fundamental question: how can a system designed for hundreds of thousands of cases still do justice to each individual fate? Finding that balance remains the ongoing challenge. Today we discussed an overview by the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees, 2024. Do you have questions or topic suggestions? Write to YouTube@EmpowerMigra.com. EmpowerMigra, understanding begins with listening.